What if I told you there is a prison in the United States that officially doesn't exist? No signboards, no documentaries, no public records you can easily find. Yet men are sent there when the system no longer knows what to do with them. This is not a place for rehabilitation. It's not even a place for punishment. It's where the American prison system sends people it wants to erase quietly, without trials in the media, without questions, and without witnesses. Former guards say the silence inside is more terrifying than violence. Former inmates say time itself breaks down, and on one night, the silence broke. What you're about to hear is not officially acknowledged, not openly discussed, and definitely not taught. This is the story of America's most dangerous prison, the one nobody talks about. The prison that officially does not exist, America's most dangerous prison nobody talks about. No signboard, no tourist photos, no official prison documentaries, and yet thousands of men have passed through its gates, many of them never the same again. Some say this prison doesn't exist. Others say it exists too much. So much that America had to erase it from public conversation. This is the story of the most dangerous prison nobody talks about. At first glance, it looks like nothing, a stretch of empty land far from major cities. No nearby towns, no visible watchtowers from the highway. Even satellite images appear strangely blurred or outdated. To most Americans, this place is just another forgotten patch of desert. But for those who know, this is where the system sends people it doesn't know what to do with. Officially, it is described as a high-security federal holding facility. Unofficially, it is known by former guards and inmates as the final stop. Because once someone is sent here, the rules change. Why you've never heard of it? The prison does not appear in most public prison data. It is rarely mentioned in crime reports. Journalists who attempt to investigate are often redirected, delayed, or quietly denied access. No famous interviews, no walking tours, and that silence is not accidental. According to former federal employees, this facility was designed to solve a specific problem. What do you do with inmates who are too dangerous for regular prisons but too politically inconvenient to execute? Gang leaders who control networks from behind bars, inmates who've assaulted or killed guards, prisoners whose very presence destabilized other facilities. They couldn't be kept in normal maximum security prisons, and they couldn't be talked about openly. So this place was created. A prison born from failure. The idea for this prison didn't come from success, it came from chaos. In the late 20th century, America faced a wave of prison violence it could no longer control. Maximum security facilities were failing. Gangs were running operations from inside cells. Guards were being attacked. Entire blocks were becoming ungovernable. The system was losing control. Internal reports began using a chilling phrase, containment failure. That's when a solution was proposed, one that would never be advertised publicly. A prison so isolated, so controlled, and so extreme that inmates would be completely cut off from influence, communication, and resistance. A place designed not for rehabilitation, but for neutralization. The location was chosen carefully. This prison wasn't built near a city for a reason. It sits in an environment where escape is almost impossible. Harsh weather, endless distance, minimal infrastructure. Even if someone somehow made it past the walls, they wouldn't survive long enough to matter. Former planners have hinted that the location itself is part of the punishment. Isolation isn't just physical. Here it's psychological. No nearby communities. No passing traffic. No witnesses. Just fences, silence, and time. What makes it different on paper? It's a prison. In reality, it operates more like a controlled experiment. Inmates are selected carefully. This is not where low-level offenders end up. This is where the system sends people it considers unmanageable. Once inside, everything changes. Movement is restricted beyond normal standards. Human contact is minimized. Communication with the outside world is limited, delayed, or denied entirely. Former guards have described it as a place where routine cruelty replaces chaos. No shouting, no riots at least not often. Just silence. And silence can be far more dangerous. Why the government stays quiet. Talking about this prison raises uncomfortable questions. Questions about human rights, about psychological torture, about how far a democracy is willing to go in the name of security. Acknowledging its existence would mean admitting that the normal prison system failed and that something darker replaced it. So instead, it's buried under legal language, classified documents, and administrative silence. Most Americans will live their entire lives without ever knowing this place exists, and that's exactly how it was designed. The first warning sign, the earliest warning, didn't come from inmates. It came from guards. Within the first years of operation, internal complaints began surfacing. High turnover, mental health breakdowns, officers requesting transfers after only months inside, one former guard later said. "You don't leave that place when your shift ends. It follows you home." But those voices were never amplified. Reports were sealed. Complaints quietly resolved, because what happens inside these walls was never meant to be part of public discussion. And this is only the beginning. This prison isn't terrifying because of one violent incident. It's terrifying because of what it represents. A place where rules bend, where oversight fades, where people disappear from public memory while still being alive. We go inside, not through official statements, but through leaked accounts, guard testimonies, and inmate descriptions of daily life inside the most dangerous prison nobody talks about. Inside the walls, where violence is normal, the first thing inmates notice isn't the bars. It's the silence. No shouting, no constant noise, no chaos like other maximum security prisons. Just a heavy, unnatural quiet so deep it feels like pressure on the chest. One former inmate described it like this. It felt less like a prison and more like being buried alive with rules. This is what happens after the doors close. The arrival that breaks you. There is no dramatic intake process here. No speeches. No warnings. No explanations. Inmates are escorted off transport vehicles one by one. Heads down. Hands restrained. No eye contact. The guards don't shout because they don't need to. Everything is already decided. Personal belongings are not logged the way they are in normal prisons. Many items are simply removed. Letters arrive weeks late, if they arrive at all. Phone calls are rare, monitored, and often cut short without explanation. From the first hour, one message is clear. You are no longer part of the outside world. A different kind of control. This prison doesn't rely on constant force. It relies on predictable fear. Inmates are kept under near-permanent surveillance. Cameras cover angles most prisons ignore. Cells are designed to eliminate blind spots. Movement happens on strict schedules that never change, and when routines never change, inmates lose track of time. Days blur. Weeks dissolve. Months feel identical. Psychologists call this temporal Inmates call it losing yourself, where violence doesn't look like violence. Here's the part most people don't understand. This prison isn't violent because of daily fights or riots. It's violent because of what doesn't happen. No casual conversations, no human touch, no sense of normal interaction. In other prisons, violence is explosive. Here, it's slow, controlled, and constant. Inmates are housed alone for extended periods. Some spend over 22 hours a day inside cells barely larger than a parking space. And the human mind doesn't handle that well. The hierarchy still exists, just quieter, even in total isolation. Power finds a way. Inmates communicate through coded knocks, brief glances during movement, and signals most guards don't notice or choose not to notice. Gang influence doesn't disappear here. It mutates. Leadership becomes invisible. Orders pass silently. Punishments are psychological rather than physical, and if someone breaks the unspoken rules, they don't get beaten. They get ignored. In a place where attention is already rare, being erased by other inmates can be devastating. The guards are not immune. This prison changes staff too. Guards work shorter rotations than in other facilities, not because the job is easier, but because burnout comes faster. Many officers request transfers within the first year. Some don't. Former guards have spoken about recurring nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, A constant feeling that something terrible is about to happen even at home. One officer admitted, "You stop seeing inmates as people. Then one day, you realize you've stopped seeing anyone as people. And that's when mistakes happen. Incidents that never made the news officially. This prison has a low incident rate. Unofficially, that number is misleading. Self-harm cases are frequent. Mental breakdowns are common. Inmates scream for hours not in anger, but confusion. Sometimes guards intervene. Sometimes they wait, because the system here values order over compassion, and silence over truth. There have been deaths inside these walls that never reached headlines, labeled as medical issues. Natural causes. Undisclosed complications. Families received short explanations. No details. No follow-up. No answers. Why violence feels normal here after enough time. Something strange happens. Inmates stop reacting. Punishment loses meaning. Isolation becomes expected. Hope fades quietly, and when violence does occur, when someone snaps, it shocks everyone because it breaks the prison's most important rule. Nothing unexpected is allowed to happen. That's when lockdowns happen. That's when privileges vanish. That's when the system tightens even further. Not to prevent violence, but to restore silence. The truth hidden in routine. This prison doesn't terrify people with brutality. It terrifies them with control. A place where suffering is procedural, where pain is quiet, where damage is invisible but permanent. Now, we'll explore what happens when control goes too far, when isolation becomes punishment, when punishment becomes experimentation, and when leaked reports suggest that some inmates were pushed beyond legal and moral. Experiments, punishments, and human rights violations. The first leaked document was only 3 pages long. No logo. No official signature. Just clinical language describing behavioral response under extended isolation. It wasn't labeled an experiment, but that's exactly what it was. The moment silence turned into something else. By the time this prison had been operating for several years, administrators noticed something unsettling. The system worked. Not in a humane way, but in a measurable one. Violence dropped. Communication between inmates collapsed. External influence disappeared. So instead of asking whether it should continue, officials asked a different question. How far can we push this before it breaks them completely? That question changed everything. Punishment rebranded as procedure in most prisons. Punishment is visible, solitary, confinement, loss of privileges, restricted movement. Here, punishment is buried in policy language. Isolation periods quietly extended. Lighting adjusted to disrupt sleep cycles. Noise levels manipulated just enough to prevent rest. Not enough to be documented as torture. Former inmates later described hearing low-frequency humming for hours. Others spoke about lights that never fully turned off or never fully turned on. When complaints were filed, responses were simple. Within acceptable operational standards. Acceptable to whom? Psychological pressure as a tool. Mental health professionals were involved, but not in the way people imagine. Instead of focusing on rehabilitation, assessments were used to measure tolerance. How long before paranoia sets in? How quickly does memory degrade? At what point does isolation erase aggression or redirect it inward? Some inmates were moved between units, not for safety, but comparison. Shame, crime, different conditions, different outcomes. One former psychologist, who later refused to renew their contract, hinted that the facility was gathering data no ethics board would ever approve publicly, because officially, none of this was happening. The isolation records, one internal report never released, but referenced by multiple whistleblowers, tracked inmates who spent months without meaningful human contact. No conversations longer than a few seconds. No physical contact. No group exposure. The report noted behavioral changes without emotional language. Increased compliance, reduced verbal response, emotional flattening, loss of resistance behavior to the system. This was success. To anyone reading between the lines, it was something else entirely. When inmates tried to speak, letters were written, appeals filed. Some inmates tried to report conditions through lawyers or family members. Most of those messages never arrived. Mail delays weren't accidental. Phone calls were monitored with unusual intensity. Legal visits were technically allowed but practically obstructed. And when outside lawyers did raise concerns, they hit a wall of classification and jurisdictional confusion. No clear authority. No transparent oversight. No confirmed violations because officially, nothing unusual was happening. The whistleblowers, the most damaging information, didn't come from inmates. It came from staff. A small number of guards and specialists began quietly documenting what they saw, not because they were activists, but because they were disturbed. One former officer later described watching an inmate stop responding entirely after prolonged isolation. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't suicidal. He was empty. The report filed afterward recommended continued observation. No changes were made. That officer resigned within months. The legal gray zone. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Much of what happens inside this prison exists in a legal gray area. Not explicitly illegal. Not explicitly ethical. Protected by national security language and administrative loopholes, by redefining punishment as procedure and isolation as management. Accountability disappears, and when accountability disappears, abuse doesn't need intent. It becomes routine. Why this was never meant to be public. If fully exposed, this prison would force a national conversation America isn't ready for, about how far security can go, about whether safety justifies psychological destruction, about what happens when control replaces justice. So instead, the story remains fragmented. Leaked documents dismissed, witnesses discredited, questions unanswered, and the system but pressure always builds. No system remains stable forever. Control creates resistance. Silence creates tension, and isolation doesn't erase violence, it delays it. Inside these walls, anger didn't disappear. It fermented. And when it finally surfaced, it did so all at once. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Because what happened inside these walls was not an accident. It was designed. Now we'll uncover the night when order collapsed, when silence shattered, when guards lost control, and when this prison briefly became visible before being buried again. Riots, deaths, and the night control was lost. It started without a sound. No alarms. No shouting. No warning. Just a moment when the cameras stopped updating in one wing for exactly 92 seconds. The nights the system hesitated according to internal timelines. The failure happened shortly after midnight, a routine shift. No scheduled movements, no weather disturbances, nothing unusual. Then a single camera feed froze. In most prisons, that would trigger an immediate response. Here, it didn't. Because in this facility, systems are trusted more than instincts, and when a system hesitates, so does everyone watching it. Those 92 seconds became the opening. What really caused the riot? This was not a spontaneous uprising. It was a release. Months, sometimes years of suppressed rage, isolation, and psychological pressure reached a breaking point. Inmates had learned patience, learned silence, learned how to wait. Communication had been happening all along through coded taps, timing patterns, shared routines. When the signal came, it wasn't chaos, it was coordinated. Control slipped first. 10. Collapsa. By the time guards realized something was wrong, it was already spreading. Cell doors opened that shouldn't have. Emergency protocols failed to activate. Backup systems lagged. Not because they were broken, but because they were designed for predictable behavior. This wasn't predictable. Inmates didn't rush guards. They didn't scream. They moved with purpose. Some targeted control rooms. Others blocked corridors. A few simply stood still watching. That's what terrified the guards most. The violence nobody filmed. There's no public footage of what happened next. But internal summaries describe multiple injuries, severe trauma, and fatalities classified as incident-related medical events. That language matters. It allows deaths to exist without blame. Guards later spoke of colleagues trapped behind secured doors, of inmates who didn't attack but didn't help either. Silence returned quickly. But it wasn't the same silence. The lockdown that followed within hours. The facility was sealed completely. No movement. No communication. No external contact. Federal response teams arrived without announcement. Medical personnel treated injuries under strict confidentiality agreements. Families were told nothing. The outside world noticed nothing, because nothing was reported. How the story was buried, official records described the event as a temporary security disruption. No mention of deaths, no mention of injuries, no mention of system failure. Staff involved were reassigned. Others were required to sign updated non-disclosure agreements. Any internal discussions about reform ended abruptly, because acknowledging the riot would mean admitting that control was an illusion. The aftermath, inside the walls, conditions became harsher. Isolation periods extended. Movement reduced even further. Privileges erased. Inmates learned a brutal lesson. Resistance only tightens the cage. Some broke completely. Others withdrew into themselves. And a few disappeared from all internal logs altogether. Why this night still matters? That night proved something the system didn't. A1 proven. You can suppress violence. You can delay it. You can hide it. But you cannot erase it. The prison survived the riot, but not without scars. Scars hidden behind classified reports, sealed records, and institutional silence. And the final question remains, if a prison this extreme can lose control for even a moment, what else has happened inside these walls that we never know? Now, we confront the most disturbing truth of all. Not about what happened, but about why America allows this prison to continue while pretending it doesn't exist. Why America pretends this prison doesn't exist after the riot. Something strange happened. Nothing changed. No hearings. No public statements. No investigations announced on national television. It was as if the night control was lost. Never happened. And that silence is the real story. The power of plausible denial. This prison survives because it lives in the shadows between definitions. It is not officially a black site. Not legally a torture facility. Not publicly categorized as extraordinary. On paper, it is boring. Administrative language shields it from attention phrases like special management, enhanced security, operational necessity. These words are powerful. They don't deny what happens inside. They simply make it uninteresting enough for oversight to look away. And that is intentional. Why exposure would be dangerous if this prison were openly acknowledged? It would force uncomfortable questions. Why were inmates isolated for months or years without meaningful contact? Why were deaths labeled in ways that avoided accountability? Why were psychological limits tested instead of respected? Answering those questions would expose not just one prison but a philosophy. A belief that some people fall outside the protections of normal justice. And once that idea is challenged publicly, it becomes harder to control. National security, the ultimate shield when concerns have surfaced. The response is almost always the same. National security, that phrase, ends conversations. It reframes suffering as a necessity. It transforms moral debate into logistical inconvenience. And most people accept it because fear is persuasive. The idea that these inmates are different makes it easier to look away. But the truth is darker. This prison is not about who the inmates are. It's about what the system is willing to do when no one is watching. The political cost of truth. No administration wants this prison on its record. Admitting its existence would mean inheriting responsibility for it past, present, and future. So the safest move is continuity. Let it operate quietly. Let paperwork move. Let contracts renew. Let silence do the work, because dismantling it would raise another terrifying question. If this prison closes, where do these inmates go? And no one wants that problem. The people who vanish into numbers inside the system. Inmates become case files. Behavior metrics, compliance scores, risk assessments. Over time, names matter less than outcomes. This dehumanization makes it easier to justify extremes. After all, numbers don't scream. Data doesn't beg. Charts don't remember. And that's how people disappear without technically going anywhere. The guards who carry it home, the cost isn't limited to inmates. Former staff describe a quiet guilt, one that doesn't come from violence, but from participation, from enforcing rules they didn't design, from watching suffering they couldn't stop, from realizing that obedience can also be a form of harm. Some leave law enforcement entirely. Others stop asking questions. Both outcomes serve the system. Why the media rarely pushes further investigating this prison is difficult by design. Access is restricted. Sources are afraid. Documents are fragmented and classified. And without a single dramatic headline, without footage, without named stories, struggle to survive the news cycle. Slow suffering doesn't trend, so the prison remains, or it is always been, outside the public imagination. The final truth of this prison doesn't exist in public because it exists to protect a contradiction. America believes in justice. America believes in rights. America also believes in absolute security. When those beliefs collide, something has to give. So the collision is hidden, behind distance, behind policy, behind silence. And the question that lingers, if a democracy can maintain a place like this quietly, efficiently, and without public debate, what else could exist beyond the edge of attention? And more importantly, what happens when silence becomes normal? Because the most dangerous prisons aren't the ones surrounded by walls and wire. They're the ones protected by indifference. By now, you've heard about the silence. The isolation and the night control was lost. But the most disturbing part of this story is not what happened inside the prison. It's what happened outside. No hearings. No national outrage. No justice. Because this prison was never meant to be discussed. It exists in the space between fear and convenience, where security is valued more than humanity. And as long as silence protects the system, places like this don't disappear. They multiply. The question isn't whether this prison exists. The real question is, how many more exist that we'll never know about? And when silence becomes normal, who decides who deserves to be heard? If you believe stories like this should never stay hidden, subscribe, because history doesn't disappear. It waits to be exposed.